Well, I've been rather skirting around the topic of the Reformation. This segment of the Crash Course Introduction to the Reformation will give you some of the background you need to understand our next required work, Cranach's Allegory of Law and Grace. Cranach painted this very famous portrait of Luther, by the way. So, we just saw one of Cranach's many portraits of Martin Luther. Cranach was a close friend of Luther's, and his art played a major role in publicizing and popularizing Luther's ideas. He also created our next required work, a woodcut illustrating the difference between Catholic and Protestant notions of salvation, presented in a way, I should note, that isn't especially fair to Catholic teaching. Luther, as you just saw, believed that Christians are saved by faith, or God's free grace alone, while Catholics believed and still believe that salvation comes through both faith and works or good deeds. You know what an allegory is, right? It means using symbols or narratives to convey hidden meaning. This kind of simple, even propagandistic woodcut helped spread Protestant beliefs. Eventually, as we'll see in the next unit, the Catholic Church also used art to fight back. The Khan Academy homework essay explored the painted version of this work. This woodcut, based on the painting, would have reached a much larger audience because prints could be reproduced more widely and more inexpensively. The left side of the composition shows Adam and Eve below a dying tree. This signifies that sin has entered the world. A skeleton and a fearsome creature prod a naked man into the depths of hell as Moses and a group of prophets point to the tablets of the law, Luther himself. Cranach consistently depicted Luther and other reformers in his portraits alongside biblical figures. On the right, we see John the Baptist directing a naked man toward both Christ on the cross and to the risen Christ in the upper right. So, is Cranach saying that Moses was misguided? On the contrary, Cranach is demonstrating Luther's belief that the law is essential to salvation, not because humans can ever truly fulfill the law or save themselves through good works, but because the law makes them aware of their sinfulness and their need to accept Christ's grace. The work is meant to be read from left to right, with the left side sending the message that the law prepares believers for the gospel, and the right side saying that salvation comes solely from faith in the risen Christ. There are many variations of this work, by the way. Here is the Schneeberg altarpiece, also by Cranach. Note that the predella includes a dramatic Last Supper. You should be aware that not all Protestants shared Dürer's or Cranach's willingness to employ art in defense of Protestant theology. Radical Protestants found all images idolatrous and often destroyed great works in a fit of religious zeal. This painting depicts radical Protestants looting Zurich churches in 1562. You may remember the image on the left of Byzantine iconoclasm. You need to know that term, iconoclasm. And, as you see from this picture of the Bamiyan Buddhas being exploded by the Taliban, it has not disappeared. We'll end this unit in what would become the Netherlands, but at this point is part of Flanders and then the Holy Roman Empire. The Netherlands were an epicenter for the religious debates and then the religious wars that broke out across Europe in the 16th century. To add to the turmoil, Flanders and Holland were now ruled by the Habsburg family. First, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, that's the ruler who called Luther to appear at the Diet of Worms, and then his son Philip II of Spain, who was the political leader of the Counter-Reformation. In 1550, Charles V enacted the Edict of Blood, which made Protestantism punishable by death. Charles, however, didn't really enforce this edict. He was too busy fighting France to bother much with pesky Lutherans. His son was quite another matter. Philip II, who now ruled the Netherlands, started enforcing the Edict of Blood in the 1560s, just as Calvinism and Anabaptism, even stricter and more radical forms of Protestantism, were taking hold in the Netherlands. And bloody indeed the religious warfare became. But even as they suffered under persecution and war, the Low Countries prospered as the center of the European economy moved toward the Atlantic. This was the period when the Netherlands replaced Italy as the banking and commercial center of Europe. So you have this complicated mix of wealth and religious struggle, with recurrences of the plague and the onset of the Little Ice Age thrown in to make life even more complicated. I want you to keep this political, economic, and religious context in mind as we glance briefly at the art of Hieronymus Bosch and then focus on Pieter Bruegel. Yes, this really is thought to be a self-portrait. It's a detail from the Garden of Earthly Delights. If you've memorized that 1517 is the year Martin Luther got out his hammer and nails, and I recommend you do memorize that date, then you know that Bosch was not a Protestant. But I've included him here not only because he was Dutch, but also because he lived and worked in the era that gave rise to Protestantism, a time when religion was turning inward, becoming more personal and pietistic, when Bosch's Dutch compatriots were growing angrier at what they perceived as abuses in the church, and when many people, probably including Bosch, thought that God was punishing his people for their sins with new outbreaks of the plague and several decades of bitter cold weather that historians now call the Little Ice Age. Actually, art historians are divided over what Bosch was trying to achieve with these strange paintings. Was he a moralist, trying to turn his countrymen away from evil ways? Was he a satirist, making fun of greed and sexual immorality? Was he a loyal son of the church, or was he a proto-reformer? We really don't know, but his works are wild and gripping, and I just couldn't bear to leave them out. This is a huge triptych, more than 12 feet wide when opened. It was painted for a member of the royal family, not for a church, and some art historians think that, like Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Primavera, it was intended to commemorate a wedding and sit over a bed, and to be enjoyed in private. Here's the triptych in its entirety. We have Adam and Eve on the left, the so-called garden in the middle, and hell on the right. And here are some bizarre scenes from hell, including Bosch's self-portrait. I've included a couple of details from the work. The top image comes from the hell panel, and the bottom image comes from the middle or garden panel. Don't ask me to explain why those figures have blue hindquarters. I have no idea. And finally, here's one other detail from the painting. Bet you can guess why Bosch was especially popular with my fellow students in the 1970s, especially those experimenting with illegal substances. Finally, we get to our final artist of the unit and one of my own very favorite painters. Bruegel was a master of what is called genre painting, that is, paintings of ordinary life. That's another term you have to know. He was, in fact, sometimes referred to as Bruegel the Peasant. Here's one of his famous paintings of peasant festivities, and here's another. But Bruegel wasn't a peasant. He came from a wealthy family and had a humanist education. Nevertheless, his paintings do capture the everyday life of ordinary people. They also capture a world beset by religious conflict and war. Where did he stand in these great conflicts? Historians don't know much about his religious affiliation, whether he remained a loyal Catholic or whether he was attracted to one of the many Protestant churches that came to dominate Holland. We do know that he thought deeply about religion and that he hated the violence that was tearing his country apart. Here is your required work and a real favorite of mine. Before we watch a video clip about this work, let's hear your reactions to its form. How does Bruegel use line and color? How does he establish depth and perspective? Well, I hope you took some time to come up with your own answers to these questions. Here are some comments that were posted recently by an amateur art historian who's actually a law professor by profession. What can I say? I have a soft spot for law professors who love art. And here's what this gentleman has to say. Hunters first captivates through its power of form. The diagonal sweep from the hunters on a hill in the foreground, sloping to a populated valley bounded by mountains in the distance, propels us through a vast space demarcated by different shades of snow and ice and suspends us above it. A line of bare trees accentuates the direction of sight, and the winding river extends our gaze. The use of perspective as a window into a widening space marks this work as a painting of the Renaissance. Bruegel was born in the 1520s when knowledge of the revolutionary developments in Italian art was spreading to the Netherlands. Bruegel's marriage of the formal innovations of the South with the more bourgeois sensibilities of the North created a new and distinctive style. Okay, back to the disembodied voice. Here are some details from the painting. Remember, Bruegel is all about the details. I love to stand close to Bruegel paintings, so close that I've been known to set off alarms and frighten security guards. But I wanted you to see some of these beautifully rendered little moments of ordinary life. And here are a few more comments from the same amateur art historian. Through Bruegel's gimlet eye, we see how the hunter's spear doubles as a rod to bring home the game. The lean bodies of the hounds recall generations of breeding for speed. He continues, but Bruegel is not content with setting up the opposition of natural elements. Highlighted is the juxtaposition, we love that word, right, of work with the play and age with youth. In the foreground, the hunters slog through the snow and innkeepers bend over and open fire. In the background, we see younger, carefree skaters on the ice. And one last comment from my new source. Despite the meager haul of the hunters, the glow of the fire, and the frolicking of the skaters celebrate a world of relative contentment, even joy. Nevertheless, Bruegel offers one more sobering dichotomy. A single dark bird, almost certainly a crow or a raven, soars above these snowy scenes in the gloaming. Others survey the view from their perch in the trees. These creatures were well known to symbolize death because they are plumed in black and eat rotting flesh. So, let's watch this segment from a video about the art of winter. I'm going to close, if you still have time, with a work that does not tend to show up in art history textbooks. It's not as fun as peasant festivities or even weary hunters tromping through the snow. Instead, this painting captures Bruegel's vivid and pessimistic vision of the religious wars tearing the Netherlands and the world apart. I will flash a few more details from this wonderful, terrible painting. I realize we're ending on a rather depressing note. We've come a long way from the confident days of early Renaissance Florence. In our next unit, we will see the art of a world that is clawing back, the art of the Baroque.